Tony Blair, welcome to Web Summit, your first time here, I believe.
It is. Thank you very much for having me here. And thank you, Paddy. And yeah, Lisbon, fantastic city, and it's an amazing summit.
Let's talk about the events overnight, the midterms in the States. It is a vote on who takes majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The results have been filtering in all night. I'm sure many people in the audience have been up to speed that the Democrats seem to have secured the House for the first time since 2010. That's what the projections are saying. But the Republicans also strengthening their grip on the Senate. What's your interpretation?
Well, my interpretation is that the Democrats took the House and the Republicans strengthened their grip on the Senate. So I think, obviously, a change in Congress is going to pose challenges for President Trump because they're going to have the ability to investigate, to inquire, to come after him and after his people. On the other hand, and it will cause problems for getting a legislative program through. On the other hand, I think if I was a Democrat this morning, I would also be doing a bit of head scratching and soul searching. Because if you throw this back and compare it, say, with Bill Clinton's midterms, 1994, or Barack Obama's 2010, you know, it's not that bad a result for Donald Trump. So I think it's one of the things I think that's happening is that America's kind of settling down a bit with this presidency. And, you know, people to a degree, I think, are distinguishing between what you might call the stuff around the president and the Donald Trump, the tweeter, and some aspects of the policy. So I think, you know, right now, you'd have to say, if you look ahead to 2020, the race is up in the air. Whereas I think if you wind back a year, most people would have thought, you know, surely this is a one-term president. So I think both sides can take some comfort from last night, but it wasn't quite the kind of huge wave of change that the Democrats thought they might get. And that's despite actually having some really good candidates at a local level and some very close races.
If we just talk about it from the GOP side and the soul searching that's happening on that side of the aisle from this part of the discussion, it seemed as though Trump had all of the noise, he had all of the attention. It was very hard for the Republicans to cut loose from Trump in their individual areas. Was this a vote on Trump in your view? Was it a vote on what he's done in halfway through his term in office?
I think American politics at the moment is about Donald Trump, so it's bound to be. I mean, I think what is interesting is that it was made into a kind of referendum on him, and you've still got a very divided America. There's one part of America that regards him as the sort of devil incarnate, if you like. There's another part that's strongly supportive. I think the question, if I was looking at this just as a political analyst, is what's happening to those group of independents in the middle? You know, where might they move? And from those results last night, they're split, so it's not clear yet that either the Republicans or the Democrats have got a grip on them. So when you, as I say, when you look ahead to 2020, yeah, you might end up with a Democrat victory, but you could equally look at those results last night and say, well, that's far from certain. And I think what it indicates in the broader politics is that this surge of populism from the right, to a degree from the left as well, it's not exhausted. It's still there, and it's still clear. And you know, you know, Donald Trump is obviously such a divisive figure. It's hard sometimes to have a rational debate about him or the policy. You know, I had an American friend who told me about their last Thanksgiving dinner. And I said, well, how did it go? And he said, it was terrible. We had a terrible family row. And I said, well, what about? He said, about Trump. So I said, really? So were some of your family, because I knew he was against Trump, were some of your family supporting Trump? And he said, no, everyone was against Trump. And I said, well, what was the row about? He said, well, the young ones felt we weren't anti-Trump enough. So this is, there's the divisiveness that there is in American politics right now. It's profound, and what last night I think shows in a way is it's not resolved for sure one way or another.
Well, Thanksgiving this year should be entertaining for many families based on that. I want to get to diversity because back in 2016, it felt as though there was a vote for the white population. And just to refresh the audience, about 52% of white women voted for Trump, 63% of white men voted for Trump. This time round, we had a lot of firsts in the midterms. The first Native American women elected, first Muslim, first openly gay man becomes a governor. What does this say about the breadth of diversity now and the fight back, given that Trump has been so strong on immigration, but also I think women have felt like they're not being represented by the White House?
Yeah, but I think, in the end, you can both overplay the degree to which people are prejudiced. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about politics, when I was in power, for example, we introduced, and this is going back 20 years ago, a whole lot of rights for LGBT. At the time, this was thought to be quite a shocking thing to do. But when we did it, we found, believe it or not, people are much less prejudiced than you think they are. So I think that's at one level. At another level, I think also, when you look at those people that vote for Donald Trump, again, if I was a Democrat, and I'm looking at this as someone who would obviously be a Democrat in American politics, I would be asking not why the people who come to his rallies are voting for him, because that's pretty clear. I'd be asking, why is it that certain independents are coming towards him? That's the issue. And I think for the Democrats, just like the progressive forces all around Europe today, you've got to be careful of getting backed into an identity politics that, if you're not careful, defines you in a way that loses you part of the middle ground, never mind the far right. And this is part of the changing picture in politics, I think, more generally right now.
I want to ask you about how practically Trump gets anything done. It seems like a very front-loaded agenda already, particularly around tax reforms and around healthcare, not to mention a tax on migrant visas and trade tariffs. What's next? Because what we've now had in the House of Representatives seems to be an ability to block and challenge some of Trump's policies, which then forces Trump to effectively try to work across the aisle. Now, you've always been a charismatic politician. Trump has been very divisive, as we've been talking about. Some Republicans don't like Trump, but they get past that because they want to support the party, they want to support the policies. Democrats won't be so forgiving. What do you think the ability is for Trump to try and get support, garner support from the Democrats to push forward with key policies?
Well, trying to predict Donald Trump is challenging. So
there's so many other things you could say there.
Right. So the honest answer is I can't be sure, but I suspect he'll do a mixture. And I think sometimes he'll try and work with the Democrats, and he'll try and put the Democrats on the wrong side of an argument if they're not going to work with them. And the other thing he'll do, because I've seen this happen with other American presidents, if you're in midterms, you're an American president, and you lose the House, the disadvantage is obviously the House can block your legislation. But the advantage is you can play off them. So you can say to your constituents, yeah, I'll be able to do all these things for you, but these guys won't let me. And then when you get to the next presidential election, you can use that. So I think, in fact, the changing hold of the House for the Democrats now poses a challenge for him, but it also poses a challenge for the Democrats.
So you're saying 2020 just got much harder for the Democrats because they now seem to have control of the House? No,
I think what these elections show is your Democrats can't take it for granted. And therefore, they're going to have to think very carefully how they play this so that it doesn't look to the public as if they're just going after Trump. They're going to have to go after him on issues, and they probably, if there are areas where he makes them a reasonable offer, they're going to have to be careful of being pushed into a corner where it looks like they're opposing things that the public might want just because it's him that's proposing it. So this is where the politics is going to get quite tricky. And I guess my point is, if you think back to 2016 and the election victory, and the first few months of that Trump presidency, at points it looked as if the whole thing might just disintegrate. And frankly, if you were hearing CNN or reading the New York Times, you would think it was just about to collapse. It hasn't collapsed. So I think it will require smart politics and real genuine thought-through political strategy, plus obviously the right candidate for 2020 that's going, because this is what I believe is the challenge, is going to pull sufficient numbers of those independents into a Democrat position.
Let's talk about the trade war, because I think that's a big one for the audience. We've now seen the impact on technology, particularly on the hardware side, as the rhetoric has increased and the tariffs on some Chinese goods have been ratcheted up. We are waiting for a breakthrough moment. Suggestions from Beijing and Washington are, once you get past the midterms and all the political noise, that perhaps there can be a dialogue and perhaps a breakthrough. Not everyone is convinced that that breakthrough moment is coming. They don't think it's going to be advantageous to the United States. What's your view? Do you think the trade war gets solved soon?
I think it's really hard to judge that, because actually if you look at the figures, Chinese exports are up. I think the trade deficit's been $30 billion for the last 2 months in each of those months. And once you start this, it's quite difficult to stop it unless there is a real change. Now, I could see a situation where you calibrate this so the Chinese make certain concessions, because there are real trade issues and intellectual property issues. If the Chinese want to do that, then I think they can do that. And I think you could, rather as happened with NAFTA, the president could say, I've put this on the table, I've squeezed everyone, and I've got a deal. If the Chinese decided to play really hardball, that would be difficult. And I think, this is one of the interesting aspects of the Trump style of diplomacy, because I think this was tried actually quite successfully, you could say, with North Korea, where in a way, the two guys sort of circle each other, and one says, I'm crazy, and the other says, no, I'm crazier than you, just remember that. No, I could be even crazier than you think I might. So it's a new form of diplomacy. But you have to say in that context, it more or less worked to at least get the thing started on North Korea. China's different business. So my best guess is that it's not really in the interests of the US or China to let this thing get out of hand. So if I had to predict, I would say there will be a deal, but I don't think it's as simple as people think.
You've mentioned the tactics, different tactics from what we've had from the US president in trying to get global affairs to move forward. And we've had sanctions that were lifted on Iran back in 25 on the nuclear deal have been reimposed this week, targeting oil, banks, shipping, all designed to pressure Iran back to the negotiating table to what the president believes would be better terms, but also the administration wanting to tackle other issues, cyber attacks, ballistic missile tests, support for terror groups. The type of tactic you've mentioned from the president, this maximum pressure tactic that got something done with North Korea, could it get something done with Iran?
Well, the problem with the Iranian situation is that the Iran nuclear deal was a deal that definitely constrained the Iran nuclear program. But the problem, I think, was that the money that was made available then to Iran through the lifting of sanctions, I think even the Iranian people feel has not been used for their benefit, but has been used to double down on their activities in the region, which are, highly destabilizing. So I don't think there'll be an agreement between America and Iran that doesn't put those other questions, particularly around their support of proxy groups throughout the Middle East, on the table, Hezbollah, Houthis, other groups. So my best guess about this is that the American administration, I think, is quite deliberately weakening the Iranian regime, And within Iran itself now, you have quite widespread protests. And for the first time, different types of people protesting, and protesting very specifically about the policies of the regime and the nature of it. So I suspect one part of this is American pressure to keep pushing on that position with Iran. It's very difficult for the Iranians to find a way through with the Europeans. And I think the issue of what they're doing in the region will become the central question.
You said on a top news channel, I believe it was CNBC, that Iran was having a destabilizing effect across the region. And when you touch upon the tactics about weakening the regime, the hardliners in Iran seem to smell blood around Rouhani, whether they can try and replace him. If the hardliners took back control of domestic politics, surely that must have an impact across the region, that Trump doesn't win in this situation.
Yes, but the problem in a way is that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which has really been the operational arm of the destabilization, I mean, they in a sense have never really tempered their policy as a result of the Rouhani government. So look, I think it's hard to tell how this will play out, but right now I think the American policy is geared towards weakening their regime as much as dealing with the fallout from the nuclear question.
While we're talking about the Middle East, I want to ask you about the events around Saudi Arabia and the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. What has that done to the kingdom's ability to move towards becoming a modern society, open to business, moving away from energy dependence? Because there's still a lot of questions about what the influence or what the role was of the Crown Prince.
Sure, and I think, obviously this was an unacceptable, unforgivable act, and it's caused a huge trauma, both for Saudi Arabia and for its relations with the outside world. Now, the strategic relationships that the West still has with Saudi are immensely important, but as you rightly imply, the key thing is the country has got to show it's returning to a modernizing path, because when I look at the Middle East today, and I still spend a lot of time there, I think there is one central question, which is, can those societies reach a point where they are religiously tolerant and where the religion of Islam is not turned into a political ideology? I mean, that's the central question. And that's why, when you look at the Middle East today, you can see the Iranian Republic exporting one form of Islamism through the Shia side of Islam. And then you look at the Muslim Brotherhood through to all the groups like ISIS, and you see a Sunni version of Islamism. And the question is, can the region really escape that and get to religiously tolerant societies and rule-based economies? And that's what's fundamental. And without the reform in Saudi, that just won't happen. So, this is going to be, I think, a big strategic question for Western policymakers, and it's obviously been made much more complicated by recent events.
Let's come back to European politics and Brexit. How good are you at trying to solve a Gordian knot? Is this one of your skills?
I am 100% opposed to Brexit. it's yeah. And up to the very end, I am going to do everything I can to stop it. I think it is possible to stop it, by the way, and because it's not in our economic interests, it's not in our political interests. I think it weakens Britain and it weakens Europe.
But practically, how do you stop it? Because there was a vote cast, and many feel that if there is a second referendum, which is what you have been calling for, it sends a very negative message about democracy. So how does Parliament, how does Theresa May in particular, steer around this issue?
Right, so how it happens is, let's say Theresa May gets a deal. She brings it to Parliament. Parliament votes the deal down. The alternative's then a general election or a fresh vote for the people, or we go out without a deal. In my view, a general election is highly unlikely because of the state of the Conservative Party, unless they're suicidal, which, in politics today you can't discount. But let's assume they're not. They won't want an election. No deal is obviously absurd. I think at least we should have the chance to go back to the people. And here's the reason why it's not undemocratic. In the 2 years and more since we had that vote, our knowledge of what it means has been hugely enlarged. And by the way, there are about 5 different versions of Brexit on offer. And if Theresa May does the deal that she wants, and I say this with no disrespect to her, she's in a difficult position, she's doing this from good intentions, but the deal she's trying to do is an attempt to find a way round this dilemma, and there is no way round it. You either do Brexit in a way that keeps us in step with Europe's rules to minimize economic damage, and that is the pointless Brexit. Because if you're in step with Europe's rules, why are you leaving? Or you do a deal that wrenches us out of the European single market altogether and the customs union, and that's going to do us real economic damage, and that's the painful Brexit. So you've got pointless versus painful, and neither is a good idea. So my view is very simple. Before we go down the path of pointless or painful, ask the question again of the British people, in these circumstances, do you really want to proceed? And you know, we're doing this tech summit here. How is Britain seriously going to benefit when we're strong in the tech sector today by pulling ourselves out of the EU digital single market? It's crazy. And wherever you look in any area of policy, the truth is, in today's world, especially with this rising power of China, nations like Britain, Germany, France, the European nations, great European nations, we should stay together and stick together, because that is the way to preserve our values, retain our influence, and advance our interests. So, yeah, that's it. Anyway.
You're a man with a vision for the country still, with a vision for the UK. You're passionate about outcomes for the UK. Can I ask you about your ambitions to return to politics and whether there are any? Because the point has been made that if there were to be a centrist movement in the UK, you would need someone who the public knows. Even though the public wants something different, they only vote for politicians. And you have a man here whose name is synonymous with the political movement. Would you lead a centrist party in the UK if you could?
So there's a good and bad thing about the public knowing you. The good thing is that they know you, and the bad thing is that they know you. So, you know, there are many, many people much better qualified to lead in British politics today than me, and I'm still hoping the Labour Party returns to what I would say is a more sensible and forward-looking path. So if you forgive me, that's one headline I don't want out of today's interview, but I will just say this, that right around Europe today, there is a need for a politics that is passionate about social justice, about opening up an opportunity for those that don't have it, but is smart enough to find ways of doing that that align with the future. And one of the reasons why this tech thing is so important and why I'm so convinced that this is central to the whole of the questions that we're discussing is if we want to map a way out of this populism, left or right, we've got to show people an optimistic way to the future. And the single biggest change that's going to happen in the world today is this technological revolution. And the real role of politicians today is to understand it, to seize its opportunities, to mitigate its risks, to prepare for it, to prepare our people for it. And the tragedy is that right at the moment when we need this debate about how we deal with this revolution and its implications, you have a right wing focused on attacking migrants and a left focused on attacking business. And neither is the way forward to the future.
Let's try and tackle the issue of technology before we wrap up then. In the last 24 hours, European efforts to lob a digital tax on some of the big Silicon Valley names that have effectively been paying half the tax rate of traditional businesses. That's the number from Europe. There's been no movement. The Germans are too scared that if they support a tax, that there might be a retaliatory tax from the president on German cars. Nordic countries have concerns about the execution of a tax. So there's no progress. What do you make of the dominance of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and the lack of or the minute tax they've been paying, and how that impacts government's ability to have revenue, to do anything with that revenue and stop populism?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The question, though, what's the answer to it? So what I've just been proposing from my institute is I think you do need a very specific form of regulation and a regulator for these big tech companies. But I would make 2 points. The first is that I think we need to do this in a way that also recognizes that we want to encourage the development of technology, and that these big companies are partly big because they're doing things for consumers that consumers like. Okay, so I am very wary of anything that gets us into the so-called tech backlash and ends up with us doing more damage than good. But I think it does need a system of regulation for those big tech companies today, and that should be done in a as smart a way as possible.
What are you talking about? Shrink them or tax them or both?
Well, I think the taxation question, the problem, and we've just, in the recent budget in the UK, we've just suggested putting a tax on the tech companies. But the problem is if individual countries do it, it's not nearly as effective as something where people come together. So the second thing I wanted to suggest was this. I think it's a really strong case for a kind of transatlantic alliance around this between the US and the EU, where even if we have independent systems of regulation, we keep them as aligned as possible, and where we recognize that we're going to approach tech with a set of values quite different from our principal competitor that will be China, right? And therefore, the important thing to realize today, as we look at this issue of regulation of tech and how we make sure that the tech companies, and of course they should be paying their proper share of tax and so on, is to realize that America and Europe have much more in common than what may divide them, and both of them have to be clever enough in order to take on what will be a very aggressive and big push from China to gain domination, particularly in the AI space. So my view is it's much better, and I would say this more generally about politics today, despite all the stuff with Trump and populism and Europe and Brexit, if Europeans and North Americans realize we've still got a lot of common. We've got a lot in common in our values and in our interests and in what we do together. And we should understand that by the middle of this century, the world is going to look quite different geopolitically. So whether it's in tech or any other area, my view is still that the best thing is for people who believe in democracy, the rule of law, independent media, free people coming together in free societies, they should stick together.
Tony Blair. Well, it seems we're out of time, and I've spent so long asking you about Trump at the start that I haven't touched on Corbyn, so we don't have to go there today. That will be for the next conversation. Tony Blair, thank you very much for joining us here live at Web Summit.